on NewsX World. Let's start with a check of the top headlines this hour. US President Donald Trump said that he expects to meet Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. Meanwhile, interim leader Delcy Rodriguez rejected Trump's claim of US control, insisting Venezuela remains sovereign. According to Ukrainian officials, Russian drone strikes have hit Kyiv just before midnight of Friday, killing 4 people, including an emergency medic, and injuring at least 19, with 14 hospitalized. Military administration head reports buildings and critical infrastructure were damaged as well. U.S. Assistant Secretary for East Asia Michael DeSombra said the U.S. will provide $45 million in assistance to Cambodia and Thailand to support implementation of the Kuala Lumpur Peace Accords as part of the President Donald Trump's peace-brokering efforts. This comes after recent border clashes that killed at least 101 people. According to U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, India's trade deal with the U.S. stalled after Prime Minister Narendra Modi did not make a call to President Donald Trump to seal the agreement, leading to Washington doubling tariffs on Indian goods to 50%, including a 25% penalty over India's Russian oil purchases. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance urged Europe to take Donald Trump seriously on Greenland after Washington floated buying the Danish territory and did not rule out military action to secure it. Israeli strikes killed at least 13 Palestinians across the Gaza Strip on Thursday after the Israeli military said it targeted a site following a failed rocket launch, with medics reporting that 4 people, including children, were killed in a tent strike in Khan Yunis, while Hamas claims more than 1,100 Israeli ceasefire violations since October. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung will visit Japan Tuesday to meet Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi in Nara. The summit will include discussions and a dinner on regional and global issues. U.S. President Donald Trump said he had a great meeting with Intel CEO Lip Butan, calling him very successful and praising the U.S. government's 10% stake in the chip maker. Intel shares jumped in extended trading, up about 75% since the CHIPS Act investment. All right, viewers, let's start with the top focus here now. U.S. President Donald Trump is saying that he has cancelled a previously expected second wave of attacks in Venezuela, citing what he called growing cooperation from Caracas. In a post on his Truth Social, Trump said Venezuela is releasing large numbers of political prisoners, describing the move as a sign of seeking peace. He said the United States and Venezuela are now working well together, particularly on rebuilding the country's oil and gas infrastructure. Trump added that at least $100 billion will be invested by major oil companies and said he plans to meet industry leaders at the White House. Despite cancelling the planned attacks, Trump said U.S. ships will remain in place for safety and security reasons. Earlier, Venezuela confirmed it had released an important number of detainees, including former opposition candidate Enrique Marquez, calling the move a step toward consolidating peace. All right, I request Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, who's former diplomat from New Delhi, to join me in this discussion. Thank you very much, Ambassador Dayal, for joining me here. Ambassador, there are many contentions as far as Trump's action in Venezuela are concerned. Now, he's saying that he's avoided or cancelled a second strike because of cooperation, but then there's Rodriguez, the interim president, who is saying that Venezuela is a sovereign nation and the U.S. is not running the country. What's your assessment?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. You know, Delcy Rodriguez, who was sworn in as Venezuela's interim president following the U.S. capture of Nicolas Maduro on January 3rd, has signaled a willingness to collaborate with the United States. While her initial response to the U.S. military operation was defiant, she has since shifted to a more conciliatory tone due to intense pressure and threats from the Trump administration. On January 5th, Rodriguez invited the U.S. government to collaborate on an agenda of cooperation focused on shared development and balanced and respectful relations. Rodriguez has signaled openness to energy relations with Washington, stating it is not unusual or irregular to trade with the US. President Trump subsequently claimed that Venezuela would turn over 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to the US, with the proceeds going to be controlled by the American government. Now, the US demands are very significant. The Trump administration is reportedly pressurizing Delcy Rodriguez to meet several specific demands to avoid further military strikes, including, of course, cracking down on drug trafficking, expelling Iranian and Cuban operatives, halting oil sales to US adversaries, and providing total access to infrastructure and oil facilities for rebuilding efforts. Now, US officials view Rodriguez as a linchpin for a stable transition, but they also maintain she's on a short lease. President Trump has publicly warned that she will pay a very heavy price, probably bigger than Maduro, if she fails to do what he thinks is right. Now, despite her public offers of collaboration, Rodriguez continues to maintain that Maduro is the rightful leader of Venezuela. So therefore, she is currently walking a political tightrope, attempting to prevent further US aggression while maintaining her standing with the Chavista movement in Venezuela. So some analysts believe that her role is of a temporary caretaker until new elections can be organized.
All right, sure. When do you think then that that election is possible? And also, let's talk about the question of Maria Corina Machado. Now, she had earlier said that it was the US that helped her flee to Norway just after her Peace Prize reception. And then there was a statement from Trump that said that she is not popular enough to lead the country. And now Trump has invited her to hold talks. Where do you think this is headed towards?
Well, it's all very unpredictable. Let me mention that deep down, Trump doesn't have much liking for her because he had coveted the Nobel Peace Prize, but she got it. So while he did offer formal congratulations, but there is no doubt that he has no liking for her. Nonetheless, given the very fluid and rapidly changing situation in Venezuela, Trump wants to send across signals that he is talking to all parties, and therefore he may be talking to Machado also, and he has shown a willingness to do so. Nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that President Trump's policy is one that leaves everybody guessing. He has stated that Delcy Rodriguez has agreed to cooperate fully with the United States, but then Rodriguez has given out some mixed signs. So one doesn't really know in which direction things are heading. Things are very, very fluid, but there is no doubt that the US wants to continue maintaining full control over Venezuela.
All right, sure. And how do you think, well, that question that I asked about when you think the elections are likely, I guess you couldn't answer that. So please take that. And then also talk to us about how do you think the US is going to use the oil resources that it now has access to, given that it's important to know that US will now have surplus oil. It already exports oil in excess, and then there's the oil from Canada, and now it also has access to the Venezuelan reserves.
Well, let us address things one by one. You know, regarding the next elections, I really can't say. The situation has to stabilize. At the moment, the situation in Venezuela is far from being that. Now, as regards the oil, you know, the infrastructure in the oil industry is reportedly not in good shape. There had been oil sanctions against Venezuela, which were put in place by Trump, by the US administration, and naturally, the lack of resources has made it a problem for Venezuela to maintain the resources of the oil sector. So it is questionable when the present US administration will be able to put all the repairs and the renovations in place which are required and start exporting oil. Now, of course, he has made it very clear that in return for whatever money Venezuela earns from its oil exports, it has to buy American products. So it's a win-win situation for Trump. The only thing is that there is so much uncertainty. There are Cuban and other sorts of guerrillas, I believe even Iranian guerrillas, who are there in Venezuela. And they will certainly act against the operations of any oil companies there in their country, in that country. Let me also mention that the oil companies are talking to President Trump, and he's very keen that US oil companies go and take over the oil sector and start working there. But at the moment, there is no clarity which of these oil companies are willing, because they are weighing all the pros and cons. The situation relating to security in Venezuela is far from clear. And the oil companies don't want to go there and find that their personnel are endangered or that their activities are negative, are countered by the activities of the guerrillas there, that they come under attack. So things are very, very unclear. Let's see when things begin to shape out. And of course, President Trump will continue to apply the maximum amount of pressure on the present caretaker interim government in Venezuela. But some of the things are really beyond their control. Even they are not able to control the state of play in their country because things are in such disarray. So let us see when things start becoming clearer and whether the objectives which the US administration has in mind can be fulfilled.
All right, sure. Thanks, Ambassador Dayal, for this conversation. Do continue to stay on with me, though. Moving ahead, viewers, let's also tell you that Russia says the United States has agreed to release Russian crew members detained after the seizure of a Russia-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic. Moscow said US President Donald Trump approved the release of 2 Russian citizens who were aboard the tanker Marinera, which was seized earlier this week by American authorities. Washington claims the vessel was part of a so-called shadow fleet used to transport sanctioned oil for countries including Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. The tanker, earlier known as Bella 1, was seized despite being escorted by the Russian Navy, sharply escalating tension between the two sides. Russia had warned that any prosecution of the crew would be unacceptable. Russian officials welcomed the decision, thanking the US leadership and saying all Russians on board would now be freed. I request Ambassador Prabhu Dayal to join me back in the discussion here. Ambassador Dayal, do you think this return of the Russians on board the ship was expected? Would you say it was expected, or is this a softening of stance on part of the US?
No, it is not a softening on the part of the US and its stand. The fact is that the US administration is trying everything possible to make the Russians look at the other big issue, and that is a possible peace deal with Ukraine. That is the larger objective which President Trump has in mind, and he will naturally do everything possible to win the Russians over. So if he releases some of the crew members, it is like a signal that he has good intentions. Nonetheless, the entire picture is very confusing and it is lacking clarity. As regards the peace deal, which is the priority with Trump, he wants to be seen as the big peacemaker because he has to show to his base camp, the camp of voters, the pro-Trump camp in the United States, that he is the big achiever and he has brought about peace between Russia and Ukraine. So that's a very high priority objective. However, the task is very difficult because while Russia wants to maintain control over territories which it has captured during the conflict, Ukraine says that peace is not possible until its territories are vacated because its constitution doesn't allow the giving up of territories. In any case, Ukraine says there will have to be a referendum. The point is that the Trump administration is trying to win the Russians over, and the release of the two ship workers can be seen in this broader context. Nonetheless, the very attack which took place on the Russian ship it was significant, and there were signs of some possible escalation of the tensions. And the situation remains very fragile, and it remains to be seen how Venezuela's relations with Russia come under attack also, because Trump has said that he doesn't want Venezuela to maintain any sort of contact with either China or with Russia, which were its big supporters. But let us see how things pan out. The present interim administration will certainly have to listen to President Trump to whatever extent, but whether the Russians will play along, it remains to be seen.
All right. Now, there were also 3 Indians on board the ship. What do you know about other nationals that are on board, and what action what action really is expected from the governments of those nationals?
Well, frankly, I only get information from you all, from the media. I have no independent sources of getting the information. So I haven't seen any reports which indicate which other nationals were there. But certainly, if there were nationals of any other countries, those countries will make all efforts to get them released, because that is a sort of responsibility of every country to assist its nationals in distress. So let us see what reports emerge, what other nationals are there. But these situations are very precarious, and we have to wait and watch and see how things evolve in the context of these very tension-filled situations.
Sure. Thanks then very much, Ambassador Dayal, for joining me once again in this conversation here at NewsX World. With that, viewers, moving ahead to now cover some news from Iran, where Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has addressed nationwide protests, accusing demonstrators of acting to please US President Donald Trump. Khamenei said rioters were damaging public property and urged Americans to focus on problems in their own country. Iran was largely cut off from the outside world today after authorities imposed an internet blackout. Phone calls failed. At least 6 flights from Dubai to several Iranian cities have been cancelled, and news updates were limited. The protests, triggered by soaring inflation, are the biggest in 3 years, with unrest reported across all provinces. Khamenei also urged Iranians to preserve unity. Let's welcome Dr. Emmanuel Navon, who's an international relations lecturer at the Tel Aviv University, and he's also a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, to join us in the discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Navon, for joining me in this discussion. What do you think is really happening now? Of course, with the blackouts and internet cut off, there's limited information now coming out of Iran. But what should Khamenei expect next as far as the enemy US he is saying is concerned?
Well, first of all, the speech of Khamenei was very clearly a speech of a desperate leader on his last leg, who understands that he's already lost control, that the people of Iran are willing to risk their lives to free their country from this terrorist regime, from this theocracy that has been crushing the population, emptying the coffers of the Iranian taxpayer to spread them around the Middle East and the world for terrorist activities. The Iranians want their country back. They want their freedoms back. And I think very clearly we are witnessing the end of this regime that took over in 1979, that has ruined the country, that has turned it into the main source of violence and instability in the Middle East. And the end of that regime is, of course, good news not only for the Iranian people, but for the rest of the region.
Who do you think is the next possible leader to take over from Khamenei? Because clearly there's large public distrust on him.
It is for the Iranian people to decide how they want to be governed, whether or not they want to restore the monarchy, which type of elections they would hold. Again, after this tyrannical regime is set aside and is overthrown, there will have to be elections in Iran, true elections, not the type of elections they've had since 1979, where the supreme leader decides who can run and who cannot, but true democratic elections. And I'm sure that this country, which has a great history, a glorious civilization, will find a path towards democracy, representative government, and it will be, as I said, for the Iranian people to decide.
Dr. Navo, how do you think Trump is going to receive this message?
I think that, as I said before, the message from Khamenei was a pathetic message from a desperate leader. And I do hope, and I am confident, in fact, that President Trump means what he says when he said that if the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran continues to kill its own citizens just because they want their freedom, then the United States, as leader of the free world, will not sit on the side and will intervene. And I think that those words, those very strong and clear words from President Trump, is also something that gave a lot of strength and courage to the Iranian people. And I trust that President Trump will be faithful to his commitment to the freedom of the Iranian people.
All right. Thanks then, Dr. Nawam, for your assessment. Viewers, we also have some more updates now coming in from Syria, wherein latest updates that are coming. Local councils are saying that the Kurdish fighters in Aleppo's Ashrafiyeh and Sheikh Maqsood neighborhoods are refusing to leave. That's breaking news development coming in. The Syrian Democratic Forces plan to resist the army instead of evacuating. The councils called calls for them to leave, a call to surrender, and said they would defend their neighborhoods. This comes after the Syrian government said it is preparing a safe route for SDF fighters to move northeast. According to the army, buses had already arrived in Ashrafiyeh to take fighters out. All right, viewers, breaking news updates now coming in. SDF fighters refuse to leave Aleppo and also shoot at buses. SDF fighters are refusing to leave both Ashrafiyeh and Sheikh Maqsood areas in Aleppo and intend to resist the Syrian army encircling them. Syrian officials have also said that around 50 buses are being sent to take SDF fighters out from the Aleppo neighborhoods where the fighting has been taking place. Those buses have reportedly been shot at. The situation is now turning ugly. That's what civilians are saying as they worry about the fighting in Aleppo. Civilians are now caught in crossfire of fighting between Syrian security forces and the SDF. In the last hour, in fact, clashes have resumed between government forces and some factions inside the SDF. All right, as we continue to bring you updates on that, for now let's move on to cover some news from China, where Minimax Group, the second of so-called AI tigers to go to public, as it saw its shares double in value on their first day of Hong Kong trade as investors clamored for the piece of a startup with popular consumer apps. The listing by Minimax, which raised $620 million in its IPO to fund research and development, that easily outshone a solid 13% climb on its debut by fellow tiger Zifu AI. However, Minimax shares has closed at $44.26 per share versus their offer price $21.17, valuing the company around $13.7 billion, and at a point the shares rose as high as $45.13 per share. Alright, with that tech news, it's a wrap on this edition of the World Report on NewsX World.